For the past 2 years, the 8th grade students completed a justice project. You might have seen them in the upper light court. These justice projects were inspired by the untold story of the Justice Bell. Most of you don't know anything about the Justice Bell, but you're in luck. Because standing with me here is Amanda Owen. Amanda is the executive director of the Justice Bell Foundation, the organization that sponsored the Justice Projects for the past 2 years. Not only is Miss Owen a writer, she's a master researcher and a scholar. She is the foremost authority on the Justice Bell. There is no one in the world who knows more about this incredible story than Miss Owen. Miss Owen, what the heck is the Justice Bell? What is this bell that you speak of?
Well, let me tell you this story and a little bit about how I came across, actually stumbled across, a story that had actually been lost to history.
Nice, give it.
So at the very end of 2015, I stumbled across, just online, a teeny little mention of something called the Justice Bell, and there was a photograph of this woman on the back of a flatbed truck with this huge bell next to her and a big sign that said, "Votes for Women." And I thought, what is this? What bell? And so I did some research and I discovered that this bell was so famous a little over 100 years ago that more than 1 million people saw it, celebrated it, saw it in parades and rallies and huge events. It was a symbol of the women's suffrage movement that was carted through all 67 counties in Pennsylvania and then traveled to other states. It was a media darling. It had front page news everywhere it went. I was really intrigued. You know, I had never heard about this bell, and I started asking around to see if anybody else had heard about the bell. I asked historians, hadn't heard about the bell. I asked librarians, I asked women's rights leaders. Nobody had ever heard about this bell, an icon of the women's suffrage movement. So that is what led me to research the story of the Justice Bell, the untold story of the Justice Bell over these last 3 years. Now, this is what I discovered, is that a woman named Catherine Wentworth Ruschenberger from Chester County, she lived in Stratford. She was a relatively well-to-do woman. She was a suffragist. And at that time, in 1915, there was a campaign to try to get the women of Pennsylvania to vote. And she came up with the idea of having an exact replica of the Liberty Bell, except without the crack, and with the added words engraved in it, "Establish Justice," which is from the preamble to the Constitution. So she had this bell made in Troy, New York at the Meneely Bell Foundry, and it was in fact a 2,000-pound bronze bell. She had the clapper chained to the side because she wanted that to symbolize the silencing of women's voices. And she said, "We are not going to loosen this clapper. This bell will not ring until women get the vote." And with that, they went through all 67 counties of Pennsylvania in this huge kind of get out the vote campaign, trying to convince men to give them the vote. This lasted for months. The bell traveled over 5,000 miles, and finally the day of the election happened on November 2nd, 1915. The men went to the polls and they voted to deny the women of Pennsylvania the right to vote. Disappointing, yes, but this further inspired them to kind of move on, to keep the fight going, which you can imagine just kind of the kind of strength that this would take. And what happened was these women, along with women from every single state in the United States, went to Washington, D.C., and they joined Alice Paul, a suffragist there, and they picketed the White House 6 days a week, all day, for 6 days a week, for months and months and months. They were called the Silent Sentinels. They were called Silent Sentinels because they stood with these banners that said, "We demand the right to vote," but they did not speak. That's all they did. President Wilson was so upset about this that he ordered these women to be thrown in jail. You know, nobody had ever picketed the White House before, so this was like a really innovative, outside of the box thing for these women to do. They were charged, these women, with obstructing a sidewalk, which they were not doing, but shockingly, they were not only arrested, but they were thrown in jail, and they were treated badly, some of them, and many of them were actually tortured. They were brutalized, they were force-fed. Finally, the outcry all over the United States was huge. They were able to smuggle little notes out of the prison. There was a demand by the people of the United States to release these women from jail. They said, these are political prisoners. You absolutely cannot jail women for standing silently on a sidewalk. Finally, the public pressure forced President Wilson to make sure these women were released. And with that, the pressure continued. The women had continued picketing all of this time. Every time one picket was thrown in jail, another woman would stand up to take her place. But finally, the bad press was just too much for President Wilson. And he started asking Congress to pass the 19th Amendment, a federal amendment that would give all of the women in the United States the right to vote. This finally, on June 4th, 1919, that passed. And so this amendment was sent out to the states for ratification, and what that meant is that 36 states, the state legislatures of those states, had to vote yes to allow women the right to vote for women's suffrage. So state after state, they're like nearing their 36 states, and then there's this lull. No other state is doing this. It looked like Tennessee might be their best bet. There were 50 legislators, all male of course, who said yes to women's suffrage, 50% who said no. Everybody descended upon Tennessee, the people who wanted the vote, the people who didn't want women to vote, and then finally there was one young man, 24-year-old Harry Byrne. He was not going to vote for women's suffrage, and his mother, Feb, sent him a letter. And she said, you better vote for women's suffrage. And so he did. And so by one vote only, the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution that gave the right for all women in the United States to be able to vote. Now, just because there's a federal amendment that all women vote doesn't mean there's not voter suppression, because there was. Many women were not able to vote. Many women of color, because of the Jim Crow South, the indigenous people were not even acknowledged as citizens and didn't get the vote to right until later. Asian Americans. So there were plenty of people, women, who still could not vote. And so there was a huge fight that took many years, and in many places is still going on, to make sure that every single citizen of the United States has a right to vote and is not obstructed in any way. In September, there was a huge party celebration in Independence Square in Philadelphia. 8,000 people were there, the governor, the mayor, the who's who of women's suffrage, and of course the Justice Bell and her guardian, Catherine Wentworth Ruschenberger, who made a beautiful speech. And the bell, which had still been silenced with this clapper chain to the side, was rung for the first time by Catherine, who was the niece of Catherine Wentworth Ruschenberger, same first name. She rang the bell, and throughout this entire country, in every state, people rang their own bells in solidarity with the Justice Bell. So after the celebration, there's the Justice Bell in the Independence Square, and then the mayor, not like a week or two later, saw two soldiers saluting the bell. And he was enraged. He was not a fan of women's suffrage. And he had that bell on the spot, carted off to a slaughterhouse to be melted down.
So what happened to the bell?
So what happened to the Justice Bell? Many years later, many decades later, a man named Reverend Stinson came across the Justice Bell in the woods in the middle of Valley Forge Park. And then decades passed, and then finally in 2015, a full 100 years after the Justice Bell was first made, I stumbled across that little mention of the bell and that fabulous photo and Votes for Women sign and a woman on the back of a truck. And when I saw that, I decided to investigate further, and that's what brought me here
Yeah.
to tell you this story.
Well, it really is an incredible story, and one that's our very own. It's our darling. It's Pennsylvania's darling. But now that you've heard about this, and you heard about the women who fought so tirelessly for change, we ask you, what is justice? You know, the people who came before us, they provided strength to those who had very little. They inspired others to join in their fight for justice and equality. And for those who were once opposed to the equality, went on to embrace change. Can you do that? Because the work isn't done. The work is actually never done. There's always someone, somewhere, who doesn't feel like they're represented. Where do you stand? What is it that you stomp your foot over and say that's not fair? Think about it. Every day, Mr. Thaler asks us to recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. And we recite, "And justice for all." What does justice mean to you? What do you do to create a just world? What's standing in the way of justice in your world? What changes would you like to see? Your teacher will be asking you to answer a few questions, whether it's on a laptop, an iPad, or on paper. Whatever your teacher asks you to do, be thoughtful and be honest. Because within the next few weeks, Mrs. Bernicki and the No Place for Hate Club will be visiting with your learning time, and they will ask that you place your thumbprint on a paint chip. Every thumbprint of every person in Colonial Middle School, once all that is completed, under the artful direction of Ms. Horwitz, an art project will be created that will include all the paint chips, and it will include all of your voice and all that you stand for. You will be amazed. But even more amazing, I'm not sure if you've noticed, in the light court, we have our very own Justice Bell. Mr. Thaler believes that every person in this building should have a voice. And with that voice comes justice and equality. So every day when we recite the pledge, we will be ringing that bell and symbolizing the thoughts of everyone in this school and the desire to have justice for all every day. Thank you. Thank you, Miss Ellen.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you.